Welcome, Jonathan, who is our next speaker for tonight. He's talking about insights and trends about succession in US family firms. I'll start with a short introduction, if that's fine for you, Jonathan. Jonathan leads PwC's global private practice, serving family businesses, family offices, and entrepreneurial owners. He oversees strategy, operations, talent development, thought leadership, and also the marketing for the sector. Jonathan also heads the global US family business and family office practice and has published through leadership and family governance, strategy and succession in national and international outlets. As lead engagement partner for some of the largest US family firms and offices, he leverages PwC's global network and collaborates with external advisors to deliver innovation solutions. Thank you, Jonathan, and welcome.
Thank you. Comprehensive introduction for me, so I appreciate that.
Let's start with the presentation now. And for audience, again, please feel free to drop your questions into a Q&A section, and Jonathan, and we can come back to them later after your presentation.
Perfect. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Alexander and I have known each other for a number of years, and so it's just such a pleasure to be here with you. And it's really great that you're organizing this and giving all of this great content back to the participants. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.
I'll start first just to give you, if we move to slide 2, I'll give you just a little bit of an overview of the family business landscape in the United States. So roughly 70% of all US businesses are family owned. So that's a significant portion of our market. Roughly about 60% of US GDP and about 65% of employment in the United States is actually from those family firms. So it's a significant part. More than half of our US economy is based on family businesses. And I think another fact that I think is interesting to many is that if you look at the Fortune 500, roughly 1/3 of those Fortune 500 firms are actually still family controlled. So large businesses like Walmart or Comcast, and there's the Ford Corporation, all of those are still family controlled, even though they are publicly listed. So again, another significant portion of the publicly listed companies are there as well. There's a lot of conversation globally around what's being described as the Great Wealth Transfer, and included in that is the transfer of ownership of family businesses from one generation to the next. Matter of fact, it actually ends up making up a significant percentage of that Great Wealth Transfer. And that's where professionals like myself and others who have spoke are trying to help those families successfully transition those transitions. They're challenging for a lot of reasons. I wanted to kind of share with you a little bit of what those challenges are, and then give you a little bit of insights into how a number of US families are addressing these issues of transition, and maybe some unique pieces in the United States that we work through with our families, and share a little bit of those insights as we go through. So let's talk about first just the challenge on the next slide. Many of you might have seen this statistic. There was a study that was done back in the early 2000s to try to determine how many family businesses make it from the first generation to the second, from the second to the third, and then beyond the third. And we haven't seen the study updated, so I would tell you these numbers are a little bit dated. However, we don't really believe that these numbers have significantly changed. So we think that family businesses that actually transition to the second generation, there's roughly 30%. That goes down to 10 to 15% as they try to move to G3. And then beyond generation 3, you end up having really 5% or less of the family businesses make it to that point. Now, I would tell you that there's a lot of reasons for that. Families decide to sell. The business may no longer be viable. There's a number of things that are outside of just succession issues that families deal with. But nonetheless, you can see that the challenge is pretty significant for families to be able to make it from that first into the second, and then certainly beyond third generation. So I would say if you're anywhere beyond the first generation today, congratulations. You've beaten the odds in a lot of different respects. So congratulations there. But let's talk a little bit about some of the issues that families are trying to tackle as it relates to succession. So on the next slide, we have done a global family business survey for the past 20 years. We've done the 12th edition, was published just last fall. And one of the statistics that we ask in each and every one of those surveys is, do you have a written and communicated succession plan? Full stop. And most of the time when that's answered, we only see somewhere between 20 and 30% of those surveyed, and we tend to survey several thousand family businesses globally, and that statistic is rather consistent across all the different territories. But to see that family businesses only have roughly 20 to 30% of them actually have that written and communicated plan, that to us is still alarming. As much work as we try to do, and others like Alexander and Intes and others, we all try to talk about the importance of succession, which is why we're speaking today. And we would love to see that statistic come up. Families will develop their own succession plan. There's a lot of different factors that goes into the succession plan, but we would hope and expect that family businesses actually have a much higher percentage of them actually having a written and communicated plan. And so what's in that plan? A lot of times you think about succession, I think the first thing that most families try to cover is, how do we transition the ownership, the shares, from one generation to the next? That's your kind of tax or estate planning. Most families go into that. They get good tax advice. They know they're trying to kind of minimize that impact to the next generation. A lot of territories, some have estate taxes, some don't. But that tends to be the first part of the plan that we see completed. But then there's other pretty significant and very focused areas that should be addressed. Leadership development, who's going to be making decisions? What decisions are they going to make? Oftentimes, the first generation business is a founder-led and run business. They've made all the decisions for the business. They're sitting in the CEO or president role, but then they've also made likely a lot of decisions for the family, on behalf of the family, and at an ownership level, not just at an executive management level. And when you transition to the next generation, you're going to have likely more than one successor. And so you've got to think about, what were all the decisions that we were making that were all being done by one individual, and how do we then try to transition and spread that decision-making process across others within the organization, as well as others within the family. So that's a key piece. When you change decision-making, you have to reevaluate governance. I know in Germany, there's a lot more required rules and regulations around having a supervisory board. In the United States, each state within the United States regulates what type of governance model needs to be held for family businesses. And in the vast majority of states, they only require there to be one board member. And so they actually don't have a significant requirement that forces family businesses to have a more robust board. And so oftentimes when a family is transitioning from generation one to generation two, this is the first time they've actually had to think about, do we need a board? Who's on that board? And how do we have those individuals making decisions? So those are a number of the really, really key topics that you focus on. Of course, there's other issues around, how do we potentially fund the transfer of shares. In the United States, we have a significant tax burden for businesses when they do move from one generation to the next. There's a 50% estate tax on that transition. There's a certain amount that gets transitioned without any estate taxes. It's up to roughly $15 million, but any value above $15 million gets taxed at 50% estate. So there's some planning that can be done to try to minimize that impact, but then there's certainly going to need to be some funding that occurs in order for that transition to take place, and in order to cover that tax burden that families go through. So let me share with you on the next slide a little bit more about what are the types of things that families in the U.S. use for this transition and succession planning. And I would say, based on what I've been able to learn, about all the different family businesses across the globe. I don't think many of these are overly unique. I think maybe some of the wealth transfer structures, the trust and other things are unique. But I'm going to go through each of these and talk a little bit about each of these and happy to answer questions in just a minute. When we think about governance, that decision-making process needs to be pulled apart in a number of different ways. First of all, there are decisions that need to be made for how to operate the business, and that is typically what is done by an advisory board or board of directors for the business itself. They are there to create accountability for the management team, et cetera. But what we also see is families also creating a different governance structure for how they make decisions as a family. And those are what we call a family council. Those family councils might use a family constitution or a family charter. And what's typically in a family constitution or a family charter is a family employment policy. So if we have next generation members join the business and want to be employed by the business, what are the rules for those family members to make sure there's great transparency and they understand the rules of the game, rules of engagement in order to be in the business? And then there ends up being other types of really important things in the family constitution, like stating the family's mission so that everybody understands the mission at which this business is being aligned and run. There's other pieces around liquidity. So examples would be where in the family constitution, you might have the constructs for a dividend or distribution policy for the shares. And so those items that tend to go in that family constitution and family charters are in a document. Those documents typically are not legal documents. They are agreements between the family members, but it's not legally binding. And so it's malleable, but it ends up giving transparency to all family members involved with decision making and involved in the business. The next step that a lot of families go through is they actually do create some legally binding documents for ownership, a buy-sell agreement. There's a concept that I've been fortunate enough to teach at the Kellogg Center, at the Kellogg School of Management. They have a Center for Family Enterprises there. And one of the concepts that they teach, and I believe is a really strong recommendation for a lot of family businesses, is when you transition ownership to the next generation, many times some of those shareholders don't want to be owners. They're not interested in the business. And if not contemplated early on when those shares transition to the next generation, if there isn't a mechanism for for a future shareholder to be able to exit their ownership, then you actually create what we call kind of an involuntary shareholder, someone who's trapped. I inherited these shares from my mother or from my father. I'm stuck with them because I can't sell them. And their behaviors as shareholders really is a result of that feeling trapped. And so they end up being highly disruptive to the business. So we often recommend for a family business to have a buy-sell agreement to allow for those shareholders who don't want to be in the business to exit gracefully and be able to get out if they really don't want to be engaged. The second legal document we typically see is a shareholder agreement. Now, a shareholder agreement typically dictates who can own shares. So a lot of families choose to have only lineal descendants of their family to be shareholders. That way they don't have a family member sell to a third party or to an outside party. There's other shareholder provisions in there as far as what happens upon the death of certain shareholders, what's an orderly transition of those shares. So there's a number of provisions that go into a shareholder agreement that help to control how those shares are managed, transitioned, and then also some other features that happen within the shareholders. The buy-sell agreement and the shareholder agreements, those are legally binding documents. So if you inherited shares and there's a shareholder agreement in place, you have to follow the rules of those shareholder agreements. The next thing that I would touch on is in the United States, oftentimes families will split their shares between voting shares and non-voting shares. So virtually all of the publicly held companies in the United States that are still controlled by families have two classes of shares. They have a voting share and a non-voting share. And those founding families tend to hold all of the voting shares. That allows them to have control over the board of directors. It allows them to have key decisions around acquisitions and other things. And that's how they retain the overall control of the business. Then there's a class of non-voting shares, and those non-voting shares are the ones that typically go out into the public markets and create some liquidity for the family. That same voting and non-voting classes of shares is also used by private companies as well. I have some family businesses that I work with that now have 30, 40 family members who are shareholders, and not all of those family members are involved in any way in the business. And so what a lot of families do is they create these two classes of shares. The voting shares stay centrally managed, typically by the family members that are engaged in either the board level or in the management level. So they're really in the day-to-day part of the business, but they're still able to have ownership with a broader family who's not involved with the business. And those shares typically sit with in those non-voting classes of shares. So it's a way to perpetuate ownership, but then to kind of take voting and take control and put that in a narrower field. In the United States, we have lots of trust structures that families use for estate planning. Some of those are charitable trust. Some of those are different trust structures that allow you to move shares into a trust structure, and that trust will hold them in perpetuity. There are trust structures that are more short-term in nature. We have a lot of different trust vehicles that families use. There's also ways at which you can mitigate the tax burden. I talked about the 50% estate tax mechanism that we have in the United States. There's ways to use these trust structures to minimize that overall tax burden for families. And so almost every family business after the first generation is owned by trust. And there are great mechanisms in order to protect the liability for the family, as well as to perpetuate the ownership. And then the last piece that we talk about is compensation and incentives. This is a robust conversation that if you're moving from the first generation to the second generation, in the first generation, you typically have one person who's the controlling owner. They make all the decisions. They're going to set what their compensation is, either their salary or their distributions they're taking out of the business. When you move to the second generation, you have more people that are shareholders. Then you've really got to think about how is compensation, how is dividends, distributions, how can more shares potentially be earned? All of that comes into play, not only for the family members that are owning the business and involved in running the business, but also for the non-family members as well, to attract really good non-family management into the business. Oftentimes we see families try to provide some level of equity ownership and equity growth in the business. And then lastly, on the last slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about just how families are thinking about some liquidity. So in the United States, we will see families do partial sale of their business. They might sell 20% of the business to private equity. That might help bring in a private equity strategic partner. That might give some liquidity back to the family where they need some liquidity. So oftentimes we might see a partial liquidity transaction. And then we also see where families look to do a full sale of their business and release the control of the business. We have a couple of unique structures in the United States. We have one called an employee stock ownership program. It's called an ESOP. An employee stock ownership program is where a plan is created, a legal trust entity is created that buys the ownership from the family, and then that trust entity and those shares are actually collectively owned across the employee base. And the management team can determine how much of the ownership is with each employee, but that's a common place. That's a nice place for a lot of families to say, look, we've had employees for years. We've really benefited from their leadership, and we want to pass ownership to the families. That's a great mechanism to do that. And then we get into the full exit, of course, family looking to completely exit their business. They can go the route of taking the company public and then selling their shares in that public exit. They, of course, could be bought by a strategic partner or by some type of financial sponsor, which is really popular in the United States with private equity or investment banks acquiring a lot of family businesses there. There are an enormous amount of tax considerations that goes into planning both partial and full exits. Unfortunately, there are stories where families have come to us and said, hey, we just sold our business. Can you help us do some tax planning? It's very hard to do tax planning once a transaction has taken place. And so we also all the time have to encourage families to think about that tax planning before the transaction, typically able to minimize that tax burden for families as we go through. And so then just the last slide I have for you today. I think, and I think you'll get a copy of these slides as we go through. Um, the planning process for succession planning for family businesses is iterative. It should not start when the current generation is deciding to retire or step away from leadership. Think the best practice for family businesses is to be talking about these issues continuously. Speak about them now. You may not address all the issues right now, but you need to start to think about what are the things that we need to solve for. And so it has to be a process at which you're really spending the right amount of time. There's going to be changes that occur over that period. That's good. That's going to help strengthen the plan. It's going to help think more comprehensively with it. And then the family dynamic piece is something, as you all know, is something very unique to family business ownership. And if you have family members in the future that potentially going to become owners who do not really understand business ownership, they don't understand governance, education is significantly required for them to really be able to engage in an appropriate way. Alexander's team here is helping to provide some of that education, which is fantastic. And then the last thing that I would kind of flag to this is in the US, there tends to need to be capital and liquidity to pay for those tax liabilities, to help fund the transition of the business. And that often, if you haven't planned for that appropriately, that actually could force the family after the death of a key shareholder, it could actually force them to actually sell the business because they don't have the liquidity there to be able to protect the ownership. So Alexander, I'm going to pause there and allow some times for any questions from the group or questions for you or anything there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, to our audience, please feel free to post your questions into the Q&A section. I would now like to start with a question, Jonathan, maybe going back to the topic of going public, which you've talked about in the presentation. How can a family best prepare for going public? And do you maybe have some tips?
Yeah, so I think the first question that a family would ask is, do they want to continue to be owners and governing the business? I think the first question to ask is, do they still want to be involved? If they do want to still be involved, planning for, as I mentioned before, doing maybe voting and non-voting class of shares, planning that ahead of time, having that in place before you go public will allow a family to be able to retain control. And again, like I said, many of the family businesses that are very well known in the United States, Walmart, for example, has two classes of shares. The Walton family has the control within a voting block, and then they govern and make the key decisions as a family there. So that would be number one. How does governance transition going forward? Number two, thinking about how what a lot of companies look at, or what a lot of investors, I should say, look at as a company is going public is, are they going to be able to have the right professional staff to run the business? So many family businesses have been run very successfully in a private format, family members involved in management, but an investor from the outside might look at that and say, have they really thought through? Do they have the right talent in place? It's been very public in the United States, and I think this is well known globally. Fox Corporation, owned by the Murdoch family, have been going through a succession challenge for many years. They're a publicly traded company, and they've really struggled. The family's been in court. They've been struggling over what's the right solutions there, and that's largely probably impacted the value of the business and the shares in the market because there is disruption. There's uncertainty about who's going to run the business. And so you really want to have thought through, do we have the right professional team in place to run this business when it's public? And then are we, properly communicating that to the investor base as we go forward? The last thing that I would say, and this would be maybe the piece of caution, a lot of families decide to go public because they need capital to grow the business.
Mm.
In the United States, the cost of going public for a company is significant. There's a significant regulatory cost to register with the SEC, the quarterly reporting requirements, everything within that is a dramatically different way to run the business rather than being privately held and being able to make decisions long-term, et cetera. And so there likely is cheaper capital that a family could raise rather than going public. And so private equity would be an example of that. You can remain being privately held. You can maybe take on 20% ownership from private equity. And it's likely that that capital infusion from private equity is going to be much cheaper than the equity you're going to raise in the public market. So that would be the other part that I really would spend a lot of time thinking through. Is it the right choice for us to go public?
Mm-hmm.
And we're continuing this issue because you were saying that you have a 50% tax on when you inherit your business from one generation to the next generation.
Right.
And one solution families in the US find is having a trust, and the other solution is paying the taxes. Does this anyone do? So paying this a high amount of taxes after 15 million of tax-free amount, and then that would be one question. And the other thing is like, is then the only option going to a trust or going public with a firm for the second generation?
Yeah, so I'll start with the last question. I certainly could transition the shares to my children without using a trust structure, and I could give $15 million worth free of charge. But anything of value above that, I still have to pay the 50% estate tax. Very rarely do families do that just from individual ownership to individual ownership. And there's a number of reasons beyond just the estate tax to do that. There's legal protection. Putting the shares in a trust will protect those shares. The family member would not be liable for lawsuits in the company, and so there's good legal protection that happens there. But the way at which you really can plan for this is, rather than waiting until the time at which you need to transition shares, the business is going to grow in value over time. And so the earlier that you can transition those shares, let's say the business today is worth $10 million, but we know it's growing really well, and in 5 years it might be worth $50 million. Well, if you go ahead and transition the shares while they're worth $10 million today into trust structures, then you're able to have it already transitioned into ownership, and the value of those shares can grow over time without having any burden of the estate taxes catching it. So that's the advantage, and that's the reason why a lot of families set up trust structures early on. They transition shares into the trust structures. That doesn't mean that the current generation has lost control of the business. It's not that at all. But they have been able to transition the ownership into a trust, and there are different ways that we can manage through to make sure that the current generation still has control. And that again would be probably a whole different webcast for me to get into.
I think so. It would be, and I think you are also the expert in this field, if I understood this correctly.
Sure.
Exactly.
Yes.
And the other thing, when you're saying that the influence is still there with this trust structure, you are not an owner as an owner holding the shares anymore. Is this correct?
That is correct. And what's used is typically a family through the shareholder agreement process that I talked about. That's one of those legal documents. A lot of times what we create in the shareholder agreement is we talk about what are the rights and responsibilities that are held in the shares themselves and therefore voted on by the trustee of the trust. But then oftentimes what you do is in that shareholder agreement, you push a lot of the rights and responsibilities of managing the business down to the board of directors of the business. That way it's kind of corporately run, it's effectively run there. And that's how you're able to still retain control and still have the right level of governance in place.
Okay, interesting. Switching the topic a bit into what you experienced in your career in terms of surprising events or also stories when you think about handing over one business to the next generation. So, is there anything that you remember there? What surprised you, what families did in their business?
I think the most dramatic stories are typically when a family hasn't done a lot of planning. So there are dramatic stories. There's a multi-billion-dollar privately held family business in the United States, probably known to families in Europe, that was sitting with two brothers owning the business 50-50. And one of the brothers died unexpectedly. And that brother had 5 children. And they did not have a provision for a tiebreaker. The way it worked before is the two brothers would argue it out and they would come to a decision together and move forward. Well, the 5 children of the deceased brother had a terrible relationship with their uncle. And so they got into a place where they were in a deadlock. They could not agree on many, many decisions. And after many years of that actually creating huge disruption for their business, the family actually ended up having to sell because they got into just a complete deadlock. Governance was broken. And so that's an example of where I think you have to be honest. Everyone's going to die. Death is inevitable. So let's talk about it. Let's get a plan in place. And God forbid if something happens to you, we at least know how the business continues to thrive, how the family can continue to make decisions. And so I think, and I can give you lots of other examples of families that did not have proper planning, and it created a really dramatic impact on the business, oftentimes forcing them to sell.
Yeah.
I would now like to go to our last question for this evening, maybe segueing a bit into another direction to the topic of the fear of letting go from founders. Have you seen that in families you've worked with, and how has that been handled successfully, and how has that improved the succession process by handling those issues?
If I was speaking to the founder today, the thing that I would tell them is what happens when you're not here, and it's when you're not here, it will happen. But when you're not here, if we can plan today for what that looks like, that is your legacy. And so this is not about you relinquishing or changing anything today that you would not agree to or have really upset. This is about continuity of the business and continuity of the family. I tend to not use the word succession with a founder. It means someone's coming in and someone's going out, and that's a terrible thing to start a conversation with a founder. I tend to talk about continuity and helping that founder understand that if they do the right planning today, get the right people in place to run the business when they're not there, have the right training to your next generation family members so they know what they need to do, what's the rights and responsibilities, what role do they need to play. If they do that today, that founder is really setting up their legacy for success. And to me, that's where the conversation needs to start, is to understand this isn't about tossing you out and putting new people in. It's not that at all. It's actually about the continuity of the legacy that individual has created.
Thank you very much for being so clear and so precise in this this point. I think this helps a lot.
Yeah, and also the specific insights about US family firms. It's really, really insightful. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Good to see everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.